One of them may very well call 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue his or her home some 15 months from now. That makes them important to the American future. And sad to say, in our current society, also makes them targets. As first reported at Newsmax.com over the weekend, threats are growing toward POTUS candidates such as Donald Trump and Dr. Ben Carson, leading one to consider then how the experts decide what is a credible threat, what is a mental midget spouting off to gain attention, and how vulnerable these men and women are pressing the flesh and being so accessible to the wrong kind of people so close. Let's dig into what this all entails from those who know the inner workings. First up, former United States Secret Service agent, also former member of the New York City Police Department, Dan Bongino, joined by the Islamic world expert from MahdiWatch.org, Timothy Furnish. I thank you, gentlemen, both for joining us. And Dan, I'm going to start with you because there's the first question. We're now hearing about these threats. Look, we hear these all the time. El Chapo went after Donald Trump at one point. Sometimes you see people on Facebook say things. How do you distinguish when it takes that step from being just a wingnut to being somebody who's deadly serious?
Yeah, it's a great question. The Secret Service is very good at this. The psychiatric and the psychological community out there has recognized the Secret Service for a very long time. Their agents' ability to distinguish non-credible threats from credible threats. The way they do it, kind of in a nutshell, I mean, I've taught entire blocks in our training center on this, is that they ask a series of questions. And these questions came about through a study they did called the Exceptional Case Study Project, where they interviewed a number of people who either had attempted to assassinate a protectee or some who had been caught in the planning stages, some who had implemented some form of the plan. And they noticed that a number of these people had a lot of these characteristics in common, whether they be a travel history, traveling and mimicking the behavior of a protectee, or one of the most dangerous things, which stuns a lot of people, is target shifting. You know, a lot of folks saw that In the Line of Fire movie, right, with Clint Eastwood. So there's this misconception out there that the John Malkovich type who stalks that one person is the most dangerous. When that's in fact not what a lot of the research shows. A lot of the research shows that it's this target shifting from a Hollywood celebrity to a protectee, a political protectee of the Secret Service. Those people may in fact be even more dangerous. So that's just a couple of the factors that go into it.
Tim, let's talk about the Muslim connection here, because Dr. Carson made headlines last month when he said a Muslim should not be president. He later clarified the statement, and apparently that's when the thinking is that some of these threats started to come in. Tim, let me ask you a very serious question, a very direct question. How important would it be, how much of a victory would it be for the extremist Muslims in the world to find a POTUS candidate and kill them?
Oh, it'd be huge, Ed, huge, no doubt about that. But at the risk of Islamophobia, let me use the phrase piggyback. I want to piggyback on what Dan just said. And again, you know, I look at this strategically. He knows much more about the tactical nuts and bolts side of this. But ISIS, for instance, if we're specifically talking about ISIS is focused ideologically on the near enemy. They focus on their enemies in the Middle East, unlike Al-Qaeda, who tries to strike the far enemy, us. ISIS, I don't think we have to be concerned about ISIS per se attacking Mr. Carson or Mr. Trump or anyone else. But what we do have to worry about, in light of what Dan just said, is these calls for what are called lone wolf, which I prefer to call roaming hyena attacks, where the ideology, the Islamic jihadist ideology, is already predisposed them to do that. ISIS has called for attacks on American military, for attacks on American policemen, and they have said explicitly, make sure when you do this, they say, make sure that the media doesn't think you're crazy. They know you're doing it because of jihad. So I think that's the kind of thing that they need to really be concerned about.
Tim, is that really it? And again, we don't want to get Islamophobic here, but let's point out that in a lot of cases, if it were to come from Muslim extremists in country, out of country, a lot of times what they want to do is simply bring attention to themselves. They want to get the media on them. They want to make people just talk about them more than ever really considering doing something. The majority, yes?
Well, I think that's true, Ed, but it's clear that in the last few years, the number of attempted attacks and the foiled attacks that we've had in this country, although the administration keeps trying to gin up right-wing terrorism, so-called Christian militia terrorism, it's just a null set compared to the potential jihadists out there and the wannabe jihadists.
Is it fair to say, Dan, that when it comes to protecting, and I mentioned very briefly in the introduction here, you have candidates that are out in the open. They're mixing with people. They're in crowds. I mean, they're at state fairs. They're at hospitals. They're places like this. These are uncontrollable situations. You really can't know what's happening every single second. Isn't that the most dangerous when they get right down there with people?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the chaos theory, right? Anytime you go out into a public, there's only so many variables you can control. Having said that, there's absolutely no way, even with a presidential security bubble, which is the most elaborate security bubble in the known universe or any other universe I've heard of, it's still there are still things you can't control. Now, having said that, there are ways, even with a smaller protective footprint, such as one on a presidential candidate, which is nothing like you get while being the president of the United States. There's still things you can do, and a number of things the Secret Service figured out over the years was using a number of counter surveillance elements, using a bunch of local cops who are familiar with the community, and little things too. You know, hands shoot, not eyeballs. So when you see Secret Service agents in a crowd with a protectee, a lot of what appears uncontrolled, some of it's actually kind of a delicate ballet, and a lot of them are focusing on hands. You won't see them looking people in the eye a lot for that specific reason. But yeah, when you're out there in a crowd with a small detail and you're a good distance from your armored vehicles and any kind of ballistic protection, you're in a very, of course, you're in an inherently dangerous situation. There's no doubt about that.
Tim, I've only got about 20 seconds left. Do you think perhaps that when any extremist, Muslim, whatever, extremists look and they hear about 24 agents are going to be assigned to each individual, you think it would stop anybody who really wanted to take the shot?
Well, like Dan just said, if they're willing to die, they're going to have a much better shot than if they're not. And most people aren't willing to die in order to do something like this, but some are.
We want to remind everybody that if you want to learn more about this, go to Newsmax.com. We broke the story over the weekend. The major media is now starting to follow it. And again, it is Trump, Carson, and others. They are getting more Secret Service protection now. Dan Bongino, Tim Furnish, thanks so much for joining us, gentlemen. Always a pleasure. Let's close today with yet another fallacy from the lips of Bernie Sanders. How about some shiny new taxes, everybody? Coming up next on The Hard Line.